It is the autumn of 1900, and the most powerful woman in China is dressed as a peasant farmer. She is 64 years old. She is sitting in a wooden ox cart, moving slowly through the dust of a northern Chinese road, surrounded by nothing but flat land and open sky, and the distant sound of foreign artillery behind her in the city she has just abandoned. Yesterday she was the Empress Dowager of China. She was the woman who had ruled 400 million people from behind a silk curtain in the Forbidden City for nearly 40 years. She was the Dragon Lady, the old Buddha, the woman that foreign diplomats feared and courtiers spent their entire lives trying to read. She was, by any honest measure, the most powerful person in Asia and one of the most powerful people on earth. Today she is riding in an ox cart dressed in rough blue cotton, her hair undone, her face unwashed, trying not to be recognized by her own people on a road leading away from the capital that foreign armies are occupying behind her. She has made a catastrophic mistake, and she knows it. She supported the wrong side. She backed a movement that promised to drive the foreigners out of China and instead brought 8 foreign armies into Beijing itself. The legation quarter has been relieved. The Forbidden City has been looted. And she has fled with the imprisoned emperor. She has spent the last 2 years holding under house arrest, both of them sitting in ox carts on a dirt road, going west, as far from Beijing as they can get before winter comes. The foreign newspapers are reporting her flight with barely concealed satisfaction. They call her the Dragon Lady. They have been calling her that for years. They have built an entire portrait of her, calculating, cruel, backward, the woman who stood in the way of China's modernization and drove it off a cliff. Some of that is true. Some of it is not. The real story of Empress Dowager Cixi is more complicated and more extraordinary than either her admirers or her enemies have ever quite managed to capture. It is the story of a girl who entered the most controlled and controlled-for institution in the world at the age of 16, with nothing except her intelligence and her nerve, and who spent the next 52 years using both to hold on to whatever she could reach. It did not always go well. She made decisions that were wrong, some of them catastrophically so. She protected her power when she should have protected her country, and the country paid for it in ways she lived to see and could not undo. But she also ruled. She actually ruled in a world and a system and an era that had every mechanism imaginable to ensure that a woman, and especially a woman who started where she started, could never hold that kind of power. How she got there is the story, and it begins not in a palace, but in a narrow Beijing alley in the house of a minor official on a November morning in 1835. Beijing in 1835 is one of the great cities of the world, though it does not think of itself in quite those terms. It thinks of itself as the center of the world, which is a different and more absolute kind of confidence. The Forbidden City sits at its heart, the enormous walled complex of courtyards and palaces and ceremonial halls that has been the home of Chinese emperors since the early 15th century. Around it spreads the city, a dense network of narrow alleys called hutongs, crowded markets, ancient temples, and the homes of officials and merchants and craftspeople who have built their lives around the presence of imperial power without ever coming close to touching it. On the 29th of November, in one of those hutong houses, a girl is born to a family called Ye Nara. They are Manchu, members of the ethnic group that has ruled China as the Qing dynasty since 1644, which gives them a particular status in the imperial system even when they are not wealthy. Her father Huizheng is a third-class official, which means the family is respectable but not grand. They are comfortable without being secure. The girl's birth name is Xingzhen. Later sources call her Lan, which means orchid. She grows up in the hutongs, in a world of narrow streets and close neighbors, in a family that has enough but not much more. She is, by the accounts of those who know her in these years, an unusually self-possessed child. Observant, controlled, quick to understand the dynamics of any room she enters. Not obviously ambitious, at least not in any way she allows to show. When she is around 15, she is nominated as a potential concubine candidate for the Xianfeng emperor. This is how the imperial system works. Eligible Manchu girls of appropriate background are reviewed and selected, and those chosen are sent to the Forbidden City to serve the emperor. It is presented as an honor, and in the strict logic of the world these families inhabit, it is. In 1851 or 1852, she is selected. She is given the palace name Lan. She enters the Forbidden City. She is, at this moment, one of dozens of concubines at the lowest ranks of a hierarchy with 8 tiers. She is at tier 6, near the bottom. The women above her in the hierarchy have better rooms, more attendants, more access to the emperor, more of everything that matters in this world. The women below her have less. Many concubines enter the Forbidden City and never meaningfully advance. Many spend decades in its walls without ever becoming anything more than they were on the day they arrived. The Forbidden City she enters is a world of complete and total control. Every hour of every day is governed by rules. The clothing appropriate to each rank. The number of dishes served at each meal to each rank. How many candles a woman of each rank may have in her rooms. How she must walk, how she must speak, who she may speak to, when she may leave her own courtyard. The physical space available to the concubines is walled in, narrow. A series of small courtyards and passages, entirely separated from the grand ceremonial spaces of the male-dominated front section of the palace. She is intelligent enough to understand immediately that in this world, power flows from proximity to the emperor. Everything else is a means to that end. She begins, carefully and without drawing attention, to make herself useful, to cultivate connections among the eunuchs who serve as the internal intelligence network of the palace, to learn who matters and who does not. And then she is summoned. The story passed down through the court is that she is in a garden when the emperor passes by. She is singing, softly to herself, apparently unaware of his presence. He stops and listens. He is captivated by her voice before he even properly sees her face. Whether this is exactly how it happened or whether it has been polished by the retelling, what is certain is that she comes to the emperor's attention and she holds it. He begins to call for her regularly. She is promoted. She rises through the tiers, quickly by the standards of the harem, from the 6th rank to higher and higher positions. She also begins making suggestions. This is where the emperor first encounters the quality that will define her for the rest of her life, and that will make her both indispensable and dangerous. She has opinions about how things should be managed. The empire in the 1850s is in serious trouble. The Taiping Rebellion is tearing through southern China, a pseudo-Christian peasant uprising that will eventually cost more lives than any conflict in the 19th century. The First Opium War has forced humiliating concessions to Britain. Foreign pressure is mounting from every direction. The Xianfeng emperor is not an especially strong ruler, and the crisis is visible to anyone paying attention. She is paying attention. She begins to offer thoughts on how the memorials from provincial officials should be responded to. She can read and write with a facility unusual for women of her era. She composes responses. The emperor uses them, sometimes without acknowledgement, sometimes with a dismissive comment about her presumption. One source records him describing her as crafty and cunning and ordering that she be disciplined. She is disciplined and continues anyway. Then in 1856, something happens that changes everything. She gives birth to a son. He is the only surviving male heir to the throne. In a dynasty where the succession is everything, and where the Xianfeng emperor has no other sons, this single fact elevates her from an ambitious concubine with ideas above her station to the most important woman in the empire at a stroke. She is made noble consort Yi, a high-ranking concubine. The child, named Zaichun, is the heir to China. She has been inside the Forbidden City for 5 years. She arrived at Tier 6 with nothing. She now has a son who will be emperor. She has, at this point, perhaps begun to understand what is actually possible. The Xianfeng emperor is not well. By 1860, he is a sick man in his early 30s, worn down by the weight of an empire that is failing on multiple fronts simultaneously. The Taiping Rebellion is still burning, and in 1860, British and French forces march on Beijing, burning the Summer Palace outside the city as a punitive measure, forcing the emperor to flee to a hunting lodge at Chengde. He takes his court with him, including Cixi and the 4-year-old heir. He never comes back to Beijing. He dies at Chengde in the summer of 1861, at the age of 30. He leaves behind an empire in crisis, a 6-year-old son on the throne, and a regency council of 8 senior officials appointed to govern until the boy emperor comes of age. These 8 men, conservative and convinced of their own authority, have every reason to believe they now control China. They are wrong. Cixi moves within days of the emperor's death with a speed and decisiveness that leaves the council unable to respond. She forms an alliance with Empress Dowager Cixi, the Xianfeng emperor's official widow, who has rank above Cixi but less political hunger. She makes contact with Prince Gong, the late emperor's brother, who is in Beijing and who has his own reasons to want the Regency Council removed. She acquires the imperial seals, the physical objects required to make any government decree official, seizing them before the council can secure them. In November 1861, the 3 of them move. The Regency Council is accused of plotting against the young emperor. 3 of the 8 men are executed. The others are stripped of their positions or forced into retirement. The coup, later known as the Xinyu coup, is complete. Cixi is 35 years old. She has gone from a minor concubine in a rigid hierarchy to co-regent of China in 5 years. She and Xian now govern jointly in the name of the child emperor, with Prince Gong as their chief minister. The system requires that she govern from behind a screen. Court officials come to audience, state papers are read and decisions made, but she is physically concealed. This arrangement, ruling from behind the bamboo curtain, becomes the defining image of her entire career. She is present, absolutely and completely, in every decision that matters. But she is not supposed to be visible. She becomes very good at using the screen, rather than fighting it. The early years of the Regency are, by most historical accounts, a period of genuine achievement. The Taiping Rebellion, which had been devastating the country for over a decade, is finally suppressed in 1864. The self-strengthening movement, which attempts to modernize China's military and industrial capacity while preserving Chinese cultural values, is supported and promoted. China begins to build an actual modern navy. New industries are developed. Foreign envoys are received for the first time in a manner that acknowledges China as a state among states, rather than simply the center of everything. She also builds alliances through a system of personal patronage that makes the court personally loyal to her. She gives gifts. She issues invitations. She cultivates people with the same methodical care she has brought to everything since she entered the Forbidden City as a teenager. The officials who owe their positions to her favor are too numerous to count within 20 years. She is learning, in these years, what power actually feels like when you hold it properly, and she is very reluctant to let it go. The Tongzhai Emperor comes of age in 1873, and the regency formally ends. He is 17 years old, and by the accounts of people who knew him, not a particularly capable young man. He has grown up entirely inside the Forbidden City under the influence of his mother and the rigid protocol of the court, and whatever natural gifts he might have had have not been well served by his upbringing. He drinks. He takes concubines. He does not apply himself to the business of governing with any visible enthusiasm. There are persistent accounts, difficult to fully verify, suggesting that Cixi's control over her son was itself part of the problem. That she allowed, possibly encouraged, him to develop habits that kept him distracted and dependent. The imperial court was not a place where even a young emperor could act freely if the surrounding structure did not want him to, and the structure around the Tangzhai emperor was entirely built by his mother. He marries a woman named Empress Dowager, and this causes immediate tension. Empress Dowager is described in the sources as intelligent, dignified, and completely unwilling to be deferential to Cixi in the way that Cixi expects. When told that she should be more agreeable and docile to the Empress Dowager, she is reported to have responded that she entered the palace through the front gate as a principal consort, as mandated by the ancestors, while Cixi was a concubine who entered through a side gate. This is not the response of a woman who does not understand what she is saying. It is a direct assertion of rank, an argument that Cixi's title comes from her son's position rather than any inherent authority. Cixi hears it. She understands it exactly. She orders her son to spend less time with his wife and more time on his studies. He ignores her, at least for a while. The young imperial couple resists her attempts to separate them. Then in 1875, the Tangzhai emperor dies. The official cause of death is recorded as smallpox. There are persistent rumors of other causes, of diseases contracted during his nights outside the palace walls where he reportedly went in disguise, though these accounts are difficult to separate from later political characterization. He is 19 years old. His wife Empress Dowager is pregnant at the time of his death. If she carries to term and the child is male, Cixi's position changes dramatically, because the child would be the heir and Dowager's family, not Cixi, would hold influence over the regency. Empress Dowager dies 2 months after the Tangzhai emperor. The cause is recorded as suicide by swallowing opium. Whether this is true or whether there is a darker explanation has been debated by historians ever since. The pregnancy, and whatever child she might have carried, ends with her. Cixi, facing the question of succession with the throne empty, does something that violates the established rules of the Qing succession. The next emperor should properly be from the generation below the Tangzhai emperor, someone who could perform the ancestral rites for the deceased. Instead, Cixi selects her own nephew Zaishan, a 3-year-old child from the same generation as Tangzhai, and places him on the throne as the Guangxu emperor. This choice, which breaks the rules of succession, allows her to continue as regent. Zaishan is 3 years old. He will need guidance for years. She will provide it. She is the only one who will provide it. The 1880s are, by any measure, the height of her power. Co-regent Xian dies in 1881 under circumstances that have never been fully explained. Some historians accept the official account of a sudden illness. Others note that Xian had begun to act with more political independence in the years before her death, and suggest the timing is convenient for Cixi. There is no definitive evidence either way. What is certain is that, after 1881, Cixi rules alone. She builds. She spends on a scale that will later be used against her by critics pointing to her indifference to China's military needs. The summer palace outside Beijing is her great project, a complex of pavilions and gardens and lakes that she lavishes resources on over decades. There is a famous marble boat, a pavilion built in the shape of a boat on a lake, constructed with funds that some historians argue should have gone to the Chinese Navy. The criticism has merit. China's naval capacity, for all the investment of the self-strengthening era, will prove inadequate when it is tested. She retires formally from the regency in 1889 when the Guangxu emperor reaches 18 and is deemed old enough to rule. She moves to the summer palace. She declares her political life at an end. This is not true. Through her network of loyal officials, informants, advisors, and court eunuchs, she continues to exercise enormous influence over appointments and policy. Many officials in the capital show more loyalty to her than to the emperor. She has spent 30 years cultivating this network, and it does not dissolve simply because she has moved to a summer residence. The Guangxu emperor, now governing in his own name, turns out to be genuinely different from his predecessors. He is intelligent, curious, and increasingly convinced that China must change radically if it is to survive the pressures bearing down on it from every direction. In 1894 and 1895, China fights and loses the First Sino-Japanese War, a humiliating defeat against a neighbor that China has always considered culturally inferior. Japan, which has been modernizing aggressively since the 1860s, defeats China at sea and on land, and the peace terms strip China of territory and impose heavy reparations. The defeat is a shock to the entire country. For the Guangxu Emperor, it is a call to action. He has been reading and thinking and surrounding himself with progressive advisors, including a reformist scholar named Kang Youwei. In June 1898, he launches what becomes known as the 100 Days Reform. The decrees come fast and numerous. New schools, modern examinations replacing the ancient classical system, industrial development, military reorganization, a free press, the outlines of a constitutional monarchy. In 100 days, the Guangxu Emperor attempts to remake the entire structure of Chinese governance and society. The conservative officials in the court are horrified. They turn to the only person whose power they consider equal to stopping this. They turn to her. She moves in September 1898. She returns from the Summer Palace to the Forbidden City with the speed and decisiveness she has exercised at every critical moment of her career. Through Yuan Shikai, a powerful general whose military forces control the approaches to Beijing, she surrounds the palace. The Guangxu Emperor, who has been warned that something is happening and has sent urgent messages to allies who cannot reach him in time, finds himself under arrest. He will remain under house arrest on a small island connected to the Forbidden City for the remaining 10 years of his life. He is emperor in name only. He attends ceremonies. He signs documents. He has no power and no freedom. Cixi revokes the reforms. 6 of the reformers who were most prominent in the 100 Days are publicly beheaded without trial. Others flee into exile and continue to argue from abroad for the constitutional monarchy they were not allowed to build at home. Kang Youwei escapes. She is 62 years old, and she has just staged her second coup. The question of why haunts the history. Some historians argue that her opposition to the reforms was purely conservative, that she simply could not accept change that threatened the structure she had built her power on. Others argue that the pace was genuinely reckless, that attempting to transform every institution of Chinese society in 100 days without building any supporting coalitions was a recipe for chaos, and that she was not entirely wrong to see it as such. What is harder to defend is the executions. Brilliant men died for their ideas in those days after the coup. China lost, in that moment, some of the people who might have guided it through what was coming. What was coming was worse than she had imagined. By 1900, northern China is in crisis. Years of drought, flooding, famine, and growing foreign presence have created a population of desperate, angry, displaced men who have found their outlet in a movement called the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, known to foreigners as the Boxers. They practice martial arts. They believe, or at least claim to believe, that their training makes them invulnerable to foreign bullets. Their target is the foreign presence in China, the missionaries, the Christian converts, the diplomats, the businesses that they see as the cause of everything that has gone wrong. She watches the Boxer movement grow through 1899 and into 1900 and makes the wrong decision. She supports them. The reasons are not entirely irrational. Popular support for the Boxers in the countryside is enormous. Suppressing them would require military force she is not sure she has. And there is a part of her, after decades of watching foreign powers carve concessions and ports and territories out of China, that is not entirely opposed to the idea of driving them out. In June 1900, she declares war on the foreign powers. It is the greatest mistake of her reign. The 8-nation alliance comprising American, Austro-Hungarian, British, French, German, Italian, Japanese, and Russian forces invades. They are not stopped by the Boxers. They march on Beijing. They overpower the defenders. They enter the city. They loot the palaces, including the Forbidden City itself. She flees. The Empress Dowager of China, the Dragon Lady, the woman who has held 400 million people under her authority for nearly 40 years, dresses herself in the rough blue cotton of a farm woman, cuts her long Manchu fingernails, which are one of the most visible symbols of her status, climbs into a wooden ox cart, and leaves Beijing in disguise. She takes the imprisoned Guangxu emperor with her, still under guard. She travels west to the ancient capital of Xi'an, more than 1,000 kilometers from Beijing. For over a year she lives there while foreign armies occupy her capital and negotiate the terms of peace that China will be forced to accept. The Boxer Protocol that ends the crisis imposes indemnities worth 450 million silver taels. It allows foreign troops to be permanently stationed in Beijing. It is one of the most humiliating documents in Chinese history. She allows it because the alternative is the end of the dynasty entirely, and even this reduced, humiliated, constrained version of the Qing is better, she believes, than the chaos of its collapse. In January 1902, she and the Guangxu emperor returned to Beijing by train. Witnesses describe her sitting at the train window, watching the countryside pass, her expression unreadable. The capital is occupied. The palaces have been damaged. China is poorer and weaker than when she left. Something changes in her after the return. The woman who returns to Beijing in 1902 is not quite the same woman who left it in 1900. She begins to implement reforms, not the radical, sweeping transformation of the 100 days that she crushed in 1898, but substantial, real changes that she had refused to consider before. She abolishes foot binding, the practice of tightly binding young girls' feet that had crippled women across China for 1,000 years. She ends it by imperial decree. She abolishes the torture methods used in the legal system, including practices that had stood for centuries. She opens schools for women. She allows girls to pursue education in ways that had been closed to them. She begins the process of establishing a constitutional monarchy, the very thing the Guangxu emperor had been trying to do in 1898. She sends officials to Japan and to Europe to study how constitutional systems work. She sets a timetable for parliamentary elections. She begins, at the end of her life, to become something close to the reformer she had spent most of her reign resisting. Historians have argued about why ever since. Some say the Boxer catastrophe broke her conservatism. Some say she was always capable of reform, but feared losing power to reformers she did not control. Some say she was simply responding to what she could now see clearly was necessary if the dynasty was to survive. Perhaps all of these are true. Perhaps, as with most powerful people, her motivations were multiple and sometimes contradictory, and she herself could not have given a clean account of them. She is in her late 60s now, moving into her 70s. She is still sharp, still in command, still holding court at the Summer Palace, and managing the business of empire through her networks of loyalty and obligation. But she is older, and the crises have aged her, and the empire around her is in a condition that no amount of reform implemented this late can fully address. The Guangxu emperor remains under house arrest on his island. He is in poor health, having suffered from kidney disease and other ailments for years. She visits him occasionally. What passes between them in those visits is not recorded. In November 1908, both of them are dying. The 14th of November, 1908. The Guangxu emperor dies in the afternoon. He is 37 years old. He has spent the last 10 years of his life imprisoned, powerless, watching through the walls of his island the country he tried to reform continue its slow collapse without him. Forensic testing carried out a century later, in 2008, reveals that the level of arsenic in his remains is more than 2,000 times that of an ordinary person. Scientists conclude that the amount could only have been administered in a single large dose. He was poisoned. By whom and on whose authority the historical record does not definitively state. The next day, the 15th of November, 1908, Empress Dowager Cixi dies. She is 72 years old. She has been unwell for several days. She dies in the Hall of Graceful Bird at Zhongnanhai, the palace complex beside the Forbidden City. In the hours before her death, she attends to the succession. She designates a 3-year-old child named Puyi, the nephew of the Guangxu emperor, as the new emperor. He will be the last emperor of China. The dynasty she spent her life protecting will outlast her by 4 years before it collapses in the Revolution of 1912. Her last reported words are a reflection on her own reign. She says, "I have ruled for too long. I have made mistakes. Governing is not easy." Then she is gone. It is late now, wherever you are. The Forbidden City still stands in the center of Beijing. It is a museum now, open to anyone. Millions of visitors every year walking through the courtyards and the ceremonial halls and the narrow passages of the harem quarter, where she spent half a century navigating the most controlled environment in the world. She entered it at 16 with nothing except her intelligence and her nerve. She left it at 72 as the woman who had shaped the last half-century of the largest empire on earth. What should we make of her? The case against her is real. She protected her power at the cost of her country's progress. She crushed the 100 Days reform and executed brilliant men for their ideas, and China paid a price for that in ways she lived to see. The Boxer disaster was her decision, and China suffered for it enormously. The reforms she finally implemented in the last years of her life came too late and were too limited to save the dynasty she had spent her life ruling. The case for her is also real. She started with nothing in a system designed to give women nothing, and she held power for 47 years in a world that tried constantly to remove her. She kept the dynasty alive through the Taiping Rebellion, through 2 opium wars, through the Sino-Japanese War, through the Boxer catastrophe, through pressure from 8 foreign powers simultaneously. That it eventually fell is certain. That it fell 4 years after her death, rather than 40 years earlier is, at least in part, because of her. She was not the dragon lady that foreign newspapers made of her. She was also not the straightforward modernizing heroine that some revisionist accounts have tried to make her. She was a woman of enormous capability operating in impossible circumstances, making choices that were sometimes wise and sometimes not, protecting what she valued with an absoluteness that sometimes served China and sometimes harmed it. History has never been very good at holding both of those things at once about a woman. It tends to want either the monster or the saint. She was neither. She was the concubine who ruled China for 47 years, in a world that told her she could not. Sleep well.